And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
In the 50s and 60s, life was prescribed for African Americans, where you could go in a store, which buildings you could go in, and the hours that you would be allowed in the store. To not obey those rules risks beatings and even potentially death.
1965. The nation is mired in an unpopular foreign war in Vietnam, and the plight of America's African-American population has reached a boiling point. Inequities in American society persist, disadvantaging blacks at schools, in neighborhoods, at restaurants, and at the workplace, leaving minorities with little chance at the American dream.
My parents represented for me people who were excluded from real access to higher education. Neither of my parents had a college education, and their ability to get or have access to higher education was very limited.
Let me go back to 1940s, because it began when A. Philip Randolph told President Roosevelt unless the defense industries were desegregated, there would be a march on Washington.
The widely heralded and in some quarters feared March on Washington is expected to draw 100,000 people here in peaceful demonstration for equal rights and employment for Negroes.
There were a series of executive orders getting up to 1960, the Kennedy-Nixon campaign. Kennedy said with a stroke of a pen he could eliminate discrimination. He was very optimistic.
Freedom is the right to share fully and equally in American society. To vote, to hold a job, to enter a public place, to go to school. It is the right to be treated in every part of our national life as a person equal in dignity and promise to all others.
The speech that Johnson gave was just prophetic and really articulated the philosophical and policy underpinnings of 11246.
2 years after the famous Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, following upon the previous actions of Presidents Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, President Johnson issues Executive Order 11246, prohibiting federal contractors from discriminating in employment decisions on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. The executive order also requires government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that equal opportunity is provided in all aspects of their employment, thus popularizing the term.
It began by Vice President Nixon, who headed the Vice President's Committee on Equal Opportunity, and in 1958 said we have to do something else. So they got the term affirmative action from the National Labor Relations Act. That's where it comes from, as a remedy. But the concept and the notion of affirmative action is to increase the pool of qualified people.
Affirmative action means that you have a hard look at yourself and say to yourself, am I using all of the resources available to me in the marketplace? And if I'm not, why not?
I think affirmative action, as properly defined, is very much relevant. People often confuse affirmative action with quotas, and they're completely different.
Affirmative action isn't quotas. It isn't lowering standards. It is outreach. It is seeking to include people, managing equal employment opportunity.
Let's underscore that the executive order focuses on equal opportunity. Affirmative action is a means to achieving that end, and people forget that as well.
I saw affirmative action as outreach, finding new places to find talent, and refining those talent streams that were productive, and then making sure there was a mechanism inside the organization to not only get people in the door, but that they might be successful inside the companies.
A decade passed before President Carter transferred the enforcement of Executive Order 11246 solely to the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP, in the U.S. Department of Labor in 1978. OFCCP is responsible for ensuring that employers doing business with the federal government comply with the non-discrimination laws.
We were trying to deal with it on an industry-wide basis on the theory that you could obviously affect the greatest amount of change if you had industry-wide settlements. In class cases in those days was you really try to make valid assumptions as to where people would have been had they not been precluded from advancing because of their gender or race. Because at the end of the day, if you looked at the amount that realistically could have been awarded, the amounts were really not feasible. So you were looking at substantial amounts in the aggregate. The executive order and regulations did not envision that, and the other thing we did, I guess when I was there, was amend the regulations to put in the ability to obtain back pay.
OFCCP plays a really pivotal role in making sure that that federal contractors in all industries really pay attention to the issues that are affecting our society.
OFCCP has a leadership role because it is the expert in promoting and developing affirmative action programs. No other federal agency has that role.
What I am most proud of is that it's not just because of the enforcement part of it, but I think that we as a nation has changed over the past 50 years. I think the demographics are telling us that we've got to take another look at how we use the workplace. So it's definitely had a major positive impact.
The government has a right to monitor who it does business with. Several years ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that called the OFCCP one of the most powerful agencies in Washington, and I think it is.
After the initial focus on discrimination against women and minorities in hiring, OFCCP in the 1980s was at the forefront of the move to get women and minorities into senior levels in corporate America through its glass ceiling initiative.
We were dealing with new theories. Sex discrimination began to become a major issue. Then it was called the pink collar. Interestingly enough, Executive Order 11246 did not include sex discrimination or sex when it was first issued in 1965. And indeed, the regulations, what was then called Order 4, did not have anything to do with sex discrimination.
My primary focus was the Glass Ceiling Initiative. I was proud to have been the architect and to have developed that initiative because it really was where the country was. The country was looking for how do we remove and where is the government in trying to remove these invisible barriers that are keeping women and minorities from the upper levels of an organization.
OFCCP was also the first agency to focus on hiring and accommodating individuals with disabilities.
I was very interested in serving the needs of the handicapped community. In those days, we were the only GABE in town. This was in the days before the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted, and so only the OFCCP was in place to identify and try to eradicate discrimination against persons with disabilities. I had come into the American workplace at the time when people were asking questions on applications about do you have or have you ever had headaches, back problems, etc. That was clearly no longer appropriate, that the questions having to do with physical or cognitive ability had to be tied to the essential functions of the job. And although the regulations did not require job descriptions per se, they certainly just required that the contractor identify the physical and mental qualifications that were tied to those essential functions. And that was brand new for contractors.
After the Vietnam War and the country's response to returning veterans, OFCCP was the first agency to focus on the discrimination against veterans. Beginning in 1974, with the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, the agency required federal contractors to take affirmative action for veterans. September 24, 2015, marked the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's signing of Executive Order 11246. On April 8, 2015, the first amendment to the executive order since 1965 became effective. President Obama issued an executive order on July 21, 2014, adding sexual orientation and gender identity to discrimination prohibited under the executive order.
First, the federal government already prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Once I sign this order, the same will be explicitly true for gender identity. We made it. Thank you.
The executive order and the agency that implemented it have had an outsized impact on the country. Today's diversity programs are simply a variation of the affirmative action programs implemented by OFCCP. So what is the future of affirmative action?
I don't know what the future will bring. I wish I had a little crystal ball, but I do believe that the culture, organizational cultures, are very, very difficult to change. And we talk about change management and we talk about all these things, but it really takes leadership. It takes the person at the top to set the tone.
In 50 years, we've accomplished a lot. In 50 years, it's pretty clear to everybody that discrimination is against the law. But in 50 years, we're still asking questions of, so why aren't we doing better? Why do we have occupational segregation in some industries? Why do we have fewer women and people of color in positions of senior leadership? Those are questions that we have to keep asking, and those are affirmative action questions. Those are questions about what is it we can do differently to change the dynamic that we're seeing. And so we still need to be doing that.
The country stands between the scars of the past and the hope for the future, looking up at the civil rights leaders who brought us to this moment in the present.
I think Dr. King would be very proud of what the United States has accomplished, what the American workplace has accomplished. The enforcement agencies, certainly the OFCCP and the EEOC, have had a very significant part in that.
At the MLK Memorial, I will be thinking about the fundamental wisdom of equal opportunity. Justice at work is so important to the way we work, to the way we feel about ourselves, to the way we relate to each other in our society, that if we don't feel like there's equal opportunity there, we're going to have larger problems in the country.
Looking up at that statue will cause me to just reflect on my own life and the changes from my childhood to now. And those changes, I think, have been quite significant.
I felt proud. I felt that it was a reminder to me that the positions that I have held, the education that I have received, was a direct result of the sacrifice that many people, including the Dr. Martin Luther Kings of the world, have made on my behalf.
I think one day we will be a human race, but that we'll get beyond the simple differences, the minor, the gender, the race, the color issues, and really learn to respect each other as human beings. But I think the OFCCP is at the forefront of that movement.
Together, and with millions more, we can light that candle of understanding in the heart of all America. And once lit, it will never again go out.